The cold was a physical entity inside the 1998 sedan, a predator that seeped through the cracked rubber seals of the windows and settled deep into Leo's bones. He was 35, but felt 100. Each shift of his weight sent a familiar, throbbing protest from his left leg, a permanent souvenir from the construction site accident that had stolen his livelihood. The smell of damp upholstery and stale gasoline filled his nostrils, a constant reminder of their failure. Outside, the city lights blurred into a cold mass in different watercolor. He rested his head against the frigid glass, the condensation instantly chilling his skin. A year ago, Sarah would have been beside him, her warmth a shield against any cold. Now, there was only an empty space and a grief so profound it had its own weight. His heart clenched with a familiar, suffocating guilt. He had failed her. He was failing their daughter. The engine ticked quietly as it cooled. The only sound in their shrinking world, a cough from the back seat, shattered the silence. It wasn't a child's simple cold. It was a deep, rattling sound, wet and heavy, that seemed to tear its way out of his daughter, Mia's small 7-year-old chest. Leo's entire body went rigid. He turned, his movement stiff from the cold and his injury. In the faint orange glow of a distant streetlight, he could see her curled into a tight ball under 2 thin blankets, her small form trembling with each ragged breath. The sound was the soundtrack to his nightmares, a constant, terrifying rhythm that underscored his helplessness. He had no medicine, no money for a doctor, not even a warm room to offer her respite from the damp, penetrating chill of the night spent in this metal box. Every rattling cough was an accusation, a nail being hammered into the coffin of his self-worth. He felt a wave of nausea rise in his throat. He had to do something. But what? His hand, calloused and trembling slightly, reached into his coat pocket and pulled out the crumpled bills and loose change. He flattened the bills on the dashboard, the worn fabric of the dash catching on the paper. 120, 2 10s, a 5, 2 1s. He counted the coins by the faint light, his fingers fumbling with the cold metal. 7 quarters, 4 dimes, 6 nickels, 10 pennies, $47.45. That was it, the sum total of their existence. It was enough for a few gallons of gas to keep the heater running in short, precious bursts. It was enough for some bread and maybe a can of soup, but it wasn't enough for a motel room, not even for one night. It wasn't enough to stop Mia's cough. It wasn't enough to fix anything. A sharp pang of hunger twisted his stomach, an ache he had grown accustomed to ignoring. The number stared back at him from the dashboard, 47.45. It felt less like a sum of money and more like a final countdown. The image of the eviction notice, a stark white paper taped to their apartment door, was burned into his memory. He could still feel the shame, hot and sharp, as their meager belongings were piled on the sidewalk. He remembered the faces of neighbors, peering through their blinds, their expressions a mixture of pity and relief that it wasn't them. The click of the lock as the landlord secured the door behind them had been the sound of their life being erased. That click echoed in the cold silence of the car now. They were ghosts, haunting the fringes of a city that had no place for them. He had worked hard his whole life, his body a testament to years of honest labor. He had paid his taxes, followed the rules, but one slip, one fall from a scaffold, and the world had discarded him like a broken tool. The system he had helped to build had chewed him up and spit him out onto the cold, unforgiving asphalt. There was no safety net, just a long, terrifying fall. Mia whimpered in her sleep, a small, fragile sound that cut through Leo's haze of despair. He looked at her face, pale in the gloom, her eyelashes dark against her skin. A single, silent tear escaped his eye and traced a cold path down his cheek, freezing almost instantly. This was it, rock bottom, the end of the road, parked in a rusted-out sedan on a forgotten side street. The weight of his love for her was immense, a crushing force that paradoxically was the only thing keeping him from shattering completely. He had to find a roof. He had to find warmth. He had to save her. He didn't know how, but the alternative was unthinkable. The desperation was no longer a feeling. It was the very air he breathed, a toxic gas filling his lungs. As he stared into the darkness, a single, terrifying question echoed in his mind. How much more could they possibly endure? As the last embers of his anger faded, leaving only the cold ash of despair, a thought flickered in the exhausted recesses of Leo's mind. It wasn't a memory, not truly, but the ghost of a story his mother had once told him. His grandfather, a man he'd never met, a figure estranged from the family long before Leo was born. The man had died alone, leaving behind nothing but bad blood and something else. A piece of property, a worthless, abandoned warehouse on the industrial outskirts of the city. He remembered a thick envelope arriving after his mother's death, which he had shoved into a box. Inside, folded and forgotten, was a deed, a legal document, brittle with age, that tied his name to a place he'd never seen. At the time, it was meaningless junk. Now, sitting in the freezing dark with his daughter's rattling cough echoing in his ears, it was a straw. A single, flimsy straw to grasp at in a raging sea. A roof, 4 walls. It was a desperate, insane gamble, but it was the only one he had left to make. He fumbled in the glove compartment, his numb fingers pushing past old receipts and a useless car manual until they closed around a worn leather wallet. It wasn't his primary wallet. It was one he'd kept from his father, filled with sentimental odds and ends. And inside, tucked into a faded pocket, was the deed. He unfolded it under the weak dome light of the car, the paper crinkling loudly in the silence. The legal jargon was a dense forest of text, but he found the key details: his grandfather's name, Arthur Vance, and the address. It was on the other side of town, a place of shuttered factories and forgotten rail lines. He felt a tremor of something that might have been hope. A fragile, terrifying sensation. A building, an actual building. It didn't matter if it was derelict. It was a physical structure, a shield against the wind and the cold that was slowly killing his daughter. The guilt in his chest warred with this newfound frantic energy. He had to get Mia there. Now he had to try. The decision was made in a heartbeat. The alternative was to stay here and wait for the cold to claim them. He put the key in the ignition, his hand shaking. He offered a silent prayer to a god he no longer believed in, begging the old engine to turn over. The sedan groaned, a long, painful protest, before sputtering to life with a roar that seemed to shake the entire street. The sound was a symphony to his ears. He put the car in drive, the tires hissing on the damp pavement as he pulled away from the curb. He didn't look back. There was nothing to look back on. Every cent of the 47.45 was a countdown timer, a measure of how much gasoline he could burn, how much time they had. He drove with a frantic focus, his eyes locked on the road, his mind racing. This warehouse wasn't a choice. It was their last stop, the final station at the end of the line. For the first time in weeks, he was driving towards something, not just running away. The feeling was both intoxicating and terrifying. The journey across the sleeping city was surreal. The glowing skyscrapers of the downtown core seemed to mock him, monuments to a world he was no longer a part of. He skirted the edges of prosperous neighborhoods, their warm, lighted windows like distant, unattainable stars. As he drove, the city began to decay around him. The clean streets gave way to cracked pavement, the manicured lawns to weed-choked lots. The landscape transformed into a graveyard of industry. Rusted smokestacks clawed at the grey dawn sky like skeletal fingers. Chain-link fences topped with barbed wire guarded empty lots filled with crumbling concrete and forgotten machinery. The air itself seemed to change, growing heavier, tasting of rust and coal dust. A cold knot of dread began to tighten in his stomach. What if his mother was right? What if the place was nothing more than a pile of rubble? He pushed the thought away, forcing his foot down on the accelerator. He couldn't afford doubt. Mia stirred in the back seat, her soft moan cutting through the rumble of the engine. "Daddy, I'm cold," she whispered, her voice raspy. The words were a knife in his heart. "I know, sweetie. We're almost there. We're going to a new place. A big place and with a roof," he said, trying to inject a confidence into his voice that he did not feel. His own hope was as fragile as spun glass, and he was terrified that the slightest touch of reality would shatter it. He gripped the steering wheel, his knuckles white. The address on the deed led him down a narrow, pockmarked service road that ran parallel to a set of rusted railway tracks. And then he saw it. Looming out of the pre-dawn gloom, it was a colossal structure of corrugated metal and brick, a behemoth that swallowed the skyline. It was larger than he could have ever imagined. For a fleeting moment, the sheer size of it gave him a spark of reassurance. Something that big had to be solid. It had to be a fortress. That fleeting hope died the moment he killed the engine. The silence that rushed in was absolute, broken only by the mournful whistle of the wind whipping around the building's corners. The warehouse was a titan, but a dead one. Its metal skin was a patchwork of rust and decay, streaked with long, dark stains that looked like dried blood. Huge sections of the wall were buckled and bent. The name of his grandfather's company, Vance Logistics, was still visible in faded, peeling letters over a massive roll-up door, but it was a ghost's name on a tombstone. The main gate was secured with a thick, rusted chain and a padlock that looked as old as the building itself. A faded, "No trespassing" sign hung crookedly, a final, ironic warning. His heart sank into the pit of his stomach. This wasn't a fortress. It was a ruin. The car, with all its misery, suddenly felt like a sanctuary compared to the menacing hulk that stood before them. Leaving the car felt like stepping off a cliff. He knew its meager shelter was a ticking clock, but it was a known quantity. This place was a terrifying unknown. He unbuckled Mia, who was shivering violently now, and wrapped her in one of the thin blankets. "Come on, baby girl. Let's go see our new house," he whispered, the lie tasting like ash in his mouth. He found a gap in the perimeter fence where the metal had been torn away, a jagged mouth leading into the property. He helped Mia through, the sharp edges of the fence snagging on his coat. The ground was a treacherous mix of gravel and mud, and his bad legs screamed in protest with every step. The wind was a physical force here, a relentless predator that tore at their clothes and bit at any exposed skin. It carried with it a foul smell, a complex miasma of damp earth, rot, and something acrid and sour that made his stomach churn. This was a mistake, a terrible, catastrophic mistake. He circled the building, searching for a way in, his desperation growing with each step. Most of the doors were sealed shut, either locked or rusted into their frames. Then he found it, a small service door on the side, slightly ajar, held closed only by a piece of bent rebar. His heart hammered against his ribs. He pulled the rebar away, the metal screeching in protest. With a great heave, he pulled the heavy door open. The groan of the rusted hinges echoed in the oppressive silence. A wave of air washed over them from the darkness within, and Leo gagged. The smell was 1,000 times worse inside. It was the thick, suffocating stench of decades of decay, of stagnant water, of mold, and of the ammonia-rich droppings of thousands of pigeons. It was the smell of death. He hesitated for a second, every instinct screaming at him to turn back, to run back to the relative safety of the car. But then Mia coughed again, a weak, wet sound, and he knew he had no choice. He took her hand and stepped across the threshold into the gloom. His eyes took a moment to adjust to the cavernous darkness. The space was immense, an industrial cathedral of failure. Faint light filtered down from above, not from skylights, but from gaping holes in the ceiling and shattered window panes high up on the brick walls. The beams of grey light illuminated swirling dust motes and the sheer, breathtaking scale of the desolation. The concrete floor stretched out like a frozen lake, littered with islands of debris, collapsed stacks of rotting pallets, skeletal remains of old machinery draped in cobwebs and filth. A thick, slimy layer of pigeon droppings covered almost every surface, a grotesque white and black carpet that crunched under his boots. The sound of his own footsteps echoed unnervingly, swallowed by the vast emptiness. He felt small, insignificant, an intruder in a giant's tomb. The hope he had so carefully nurtured during the drive evaporated instantly, replaced by a cold, heavy dread. Then he looked up, and the true horror of their situation became clear. A massive section of the corrugated metal roof had completely collapsed inward, creating a jagged, gaping wound open to the sky. Below it, a vast, shallow lake of black, stagnant rainwater covered a huge portion of the floor. The steady, rhythmic drip of water from the edges of the hole was the only constant sound, a relentless water torture marking the passage of time. Each drop hitting the pool below was a tiny nail being hammered into his coffin. There was no shelter here. The collapsed roof acted as a funnel, drawing the rain and the cold directly into the heart of the building. He could see his breath, a thick white plume in the frigid air. A wave of dizziness washed over him. It was colder in here than it was outside. The solid walls seemed to channel the wind, creating chilling drafts that snaked through the debris, colder and more biting than the open air they had just left. The shattered windows high above were like vacant, staring eyes in a skull. Most of the glass was gone, and the wind howled through the empty frames, a low, mournful moan that seemed to be the voice of the building itself. It was the sound of utter desolation. It was a constant, chilling reminder that there was no refuge here, no escape from the elements. This wasn't a structure that could protect them. It was a trap that would amplify their suffering. He felt the cold seep through the soles of his boots from the damp concrete, a creeping numbness that began to spread up his legs. He pulled Mia closer, her small body trembling against his. He could feel the cold radiating off of her, and a surge of primal fear, sharp and sickening, shot through him. He had brought her from a cold, cramped car to a freezing, cavernous ruin. He hadn't found a solution. He had found a colder, more dangerous circle of hell. He scanned the shadows, his ears straining against the howl of the wind. He heard a faint scuttling sound from a nearby pile of collapsed shelves. Then another, rats, dozens of them likely. The thought of them scurrying over their bodies in the dark made his skin crawl. The place wasn't just empty, it was infested. It was not a sanctuary. It was a diseased husk teeming with vermin and decay. This building was a monument to his own failure, a colossal symbol of his inability to provide even the most basic necessity for his child. The weight of it all, the injury, the eviction, the hunger, the relentless cold, and now this final, crushing disappointment, was too much to bear. The strength that had propelled him this far, the frantic energy born of desperation, suddenly abandoned him. His body felt like it was made of lead. His bad leg, which he had been ignoring, buckled beneath him without warning. He didn't have the strength to fight it. He collapsed to his knees on the filthy concrete floor, the impact jarring his entire body. He pulled Mia down with him, cradling her tightly in his lap, trying to shield her from the ground with his own body. She didn't cry. She just buried her face in his jacket, her small frame racked with silent shivers. Her silence was a judgment far more damning than any scream could be. He had promised her a roof, and he had brought her to a place where the sky was visible through a gaping hole. He had promised her warmth, and he had led her into a wind tunnel of industrial decay. The last flickering ember of hope inside him was extinguished, plunged into an icy darkness. A wave of pure, unadulterated despair washed over him, so powerful it was physically nauseating. He had hit rock bottom before in the car. He had been wrong. This was rock bottom. This was a grave, and he had just willingly walked himself and his daughter into it. He rested his cheek on the top of Mia's head, her hair damp and cold against his skin. He closed his eyes, not in sleep but in utter defeat. The rhythmic drip of the water, the mournful howl of the wind, the scuttling of unseen things in the darkness, it was the symphony of the end. He had no more ideas, no more plans, no more strength. The 47.45 in his pocket was a joke, a meaningless pittance in the face of this colossal failure. He felt a profound and terrifying stillness settle over him. It was the stillness of surrender. For the first time, he truly believed they were not going to make it. He held his daughter tighter, the sharp edges of his own bones pressing against her small body. There was nothing left to do but wait. Wait for the cold to finish its work. Here, in the dark, on the floor of a forgotten warehouse that was supposed to be their salvation. The raw, physical pain from his leg was a distant throb compared to the agony in his soul. He had tried to be a good father, a good man. He had worked, he had provided, he had loved, and it had all amounted to this, kneeling in filth, in a building that mocked him with its sheer, empty uselessness. A tear, hot with shame, escaped his eye and fell onto Mia's hair. Then another. He didn't try to stop them. The tears were all he had left. The warehouse seemed to breathe around them, its cold, dead lungs inhaling and exhaling the winter wind. He thought of Sarah, of her smile, of her warmth, and a sob caught in his throat, a ragged, painful sound that was immediately swallowed by the immensity of the space. He had failed her. He had failed Mia. And now, at the absolute bottom, surrounded by the wreckage of his grandfather's legacy and his own life, he couldn't see any way back up. There was only down, deeper and deeper into the cold and the dark. Several nights passed in a monotonous cycle of shivering and shallow, fitful sleep. Leo had managed to find a slightly less exposed corner of the vast warehouse, a small alcove formed by a collapsed stack of steel shelving that offered a meager break from the relentless wind. He had scavenged scraps of cardboard and plastic sheeting to create a pathetic lean-to, a den within the ruin. Their world had shrunk to this 10 by 10-foot space. During the day, he would venture out into the cavernous gloom to search for anything useful, his limp a constant, throbbing ache. Mia, wrapped in every piece of fabric they owned, rarely moved, her energy sapped by the cold and her persistent, rattling cough. One evening, as a freezing rain began to drum against the remaining sections of the metal roof, Leo was trying to patch a broken window frame high on the brick wall, stuffing wads of damp newspaper into the gaps to stop a particularly vicious draft. It was a futile, desperate act against an overwhelming enemy. He felt the cold in his marrow, a deep, cellular chill that hope could no longer touch. It was then that he saw it. In a far dark corner of the warehouse, a place he hadn't dared to explore, a single, bare light bulb hanging from a long-dead conduit flickered to life. It cast a weak, sickly yellow glow for 3, maybe 4 seconds, long enough to illuminate the grime-caked brick wall behind it and a constellation of swirling dust motes. Then, as suddenly as it appeared, it died, plunging the corner back into impenetrable blackness. Leo froze, his hand still holding a clump of wet paper. He blinked, convinced his exhausted mind, starved and sleep-deprived, was finally fracturing. A hallucination. It had to be. He stared into the darkness, his heart hammering against his ribs, waiting for it to happen again. But there was only the sound of the rain and the mournful howl of the wind. He knew with absolute certainty that the power to this building had been cut off for at least 30 years. There was no electricity. There could be no light. He felt a wave of dizziness, a terrifying sense that he was losing his grip on reality. He was about to dismiss it, to blame the phantoms of his own breaking mind, when a tiny voice whispered from the nest of blankets below, "Daddy!" Mia's voice was raspy, barely audible over the wind. "Who turned on the light?" The words hit Leo like a physical blow, stealing the air from his lungs. It was real. She had seen it too. An icy dread, colder and sharper than the wind, slithered down his spine. The warehouse, which had been a place of desolate emptiness, was suddenly filled with a presence. The vast, dark spaces no longer seemed empty but hiding something. The fear was primal. They were not alone. His first instinct was to grab Mia, to run back to the rust-bucket sedan, to flee this place. But where would they go? Back to the streets, back to the slow, freezing death in the car. His terror was quickly being eclipsed by a different, more powerful emotion, a frantic, desperate need to understand what he had just seen. The light was impossible, yet it had happened, and an impossible light was better than no light at all. "Stay right here, sweetie. Don't move," Leo whispered, his voice tight. He slid down from the crate he'd been standing on, his bad leg jarring painfully as he landed. He grabbed a heavy, rusty pipe he'd been keeping as a makeshift weapon, its cold metal a small inadequate comfort in his hand. Every instinct screamed at him to stay in their small corner of relative safety, but the mystery of the light pulled him forward. He began to walk towards the far corner of the warehouse, his footsteps echoing unnervingly in the vast, dark space. The crunch of shattered glass and debris under his boots sounded deafeningly loud. The darkness in that corner seemed to press in on him, a physical weight. He moved slowly, deliberately, his senses on high alert. The smell of rot and decay seemed stronger here. The air was still and heavy. He held the pipe out in front of him, his knuckles white, his breath held tight in his chest, expecting at any moment for a figure to emerge from the shadows. He reached the corner where the light had appeared, his back crawling with apprehension. He swept his pipe through the air, hitting nothing but shadows. There was no one there. He looked up, searching for the source. There was no light bulb, no hanging wire, nothing. Just a flat, unbroken expanse of grimy, soot-stained brickwork that stretched from the floor to the high, broken ceiling. It was just a wall, a dead end. He ran his trembling hand over the cold, damp bricks, feeling the rough, gritty texture under his fingertips. He looked for a switch, a junction box, any sign of electrical wiring. There was nothing. It was as if the light had materialized from thin air, a ghostly anomaly with no physical source. He felt a profound sense of confusion and a deep, Unsettling chill that had nothing to do with the temperature. Was this place haunted? Was the ghost of his estranged grandfather playing tricks on him? Or was he truly going mad? He leaned his forehead against the cold brick, the impossibility of it all washing over him. The next morning, the image of the phantom light was burned into his mind. He couldn't shake it. After ensuring Mia was as warm as he could make her, he returned to the mysterious wall, drawn by an obsessive curiosity. In the flat grey light of dawn filtering through the shattered windows, the wall looked just as mundane as it had the night before. It was an impassive, uninteresting slab of old brick and mortar, but the light had been real. Mia had seen it. There had to be an explanation. He began to examine it more closely, abandoning fear for a more methodical approach. He was a construction worker. He knew how buildings were put together, and he knew how they could be taken apart. He ran his calloused fingers over the mortar lines, tracing the patterns, feeling for inconsistencies. He was looking for a secret, and he was willing to tear the whole building apart with his bare hands if he had to. This mystery was the first thing in months that felt like it might lead somewhere other than a dead end. As he scanned the wall, his eyes moving from brick to brick, he noticed something odd. It was a detail he would have easily missed if he weren't looking so intently. While most of the warehouse walls were streaked with decades of grime, water stains, and thick, drooping cobwebs, this particular section of brickwork was different. It was still filthy, but the pattern of decay was wrong. The dust was finer, less caked on, and the mortar lines, while dark, seemed sharper, less eroded than the surrounding walls. It looked newer, not new, but newer, as if it hadn't been exposed to the elements for as long. A thought sparked in his mind. What if this wall wasn't part of the original exterior structure? What if it had been built inside the warehouse, long after the rest of the building was complete? A wall within a wall. The idea sent a jolt of adrenaline through him, a current of electricity that momentarily banished the cold. He was onto something. He found the rusty wrench he had seen earlier, its weight solid and purposeful in his hand. He returned to the wall and began to tap. He started at one end, methodically tapping each brick with the steel head of the wrench. Thud, thud, thud. Each impact produced a dull, solid sound that spoke of thick, load-bearing masonry. The sound was absorbed by the mass behind it, flat and final. He moved along the wall, his frustration mounting with each solid thud. Maybe he was wrong. Maybe it was just a wall. But then, as he reached the center of the section, directly below where he thought he had seen the light, the sound changed. Thud, thud, thunk. It was a subtle difference, but unmistakable to his trained ear. The sound was higher-pitched, hollower. It reverberated, betraying an empty space behind it. His heart leaped into his throat. He tapped it again. Thunk, thunk. It was hollow. The wall was a lie. He pushed against the hollow-sounding section with the palm of his hand. Throwing his weight into it, nothing happened. It was sealed tight. He examined the mortar lines around the bricks and saw a hairline crack, almost invisible, that didn't follow the natural pattern. He jammed the flattened end of the wrench into the crack. It sank in 1/4 of an inch. A frantic energy surged through him, the energy of a man who had nothing left to lose. Using the wall as leverage, he put his entire body weight onto the wrench, pulling backward with a guttural grunt. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, with a low, scraping groan of stone against stone, something gave way. Dust and bits of mortar rained down onto the floor. He pulled again, harder, his muscles screaming in protest. The scraping became a deep, grinding screech as a whole section of the brickwork, about 6 feet high and 4 feet wide, began to pivot slowly inward. With a final shudder, the false wall swung open, revealing a pitch-black opening. It wasn't the outside. It was a room. A small, sealed office that had been hidden behind the facade for years. A wave of air, completely different from the air in the warehouse, washed over him. It was musty, dry, and thick with the scent of old paper, leather, and undisturbed dust. It was the smell of a time capsule. He stood at the threshold, peering into the darkness, his heart hammering against his ribs. The sheer, deliberate secrecy of it all was staggering. Someone had gone to extraordinary lengths to hide this place. His grandfather. It had to be. This was his warehouse, his secret. Leo felt like an intruder, an archaeologist breaking the seal on a pharaoh's tomb. He took a hesitant step forward, crossing the threshold from the cold, damp ruin of the present into the dry, silent mystery of the past. The heavy brick door swung slowly shut behind him, plunging him into near total darkness and a profound, unnerving silence. He fumbled in his pocket for the cheap, disposable lighter he'd been using to start small fires for warmth. The tiny flame flickered to life, casting dancing, monstrous shadows on the walls of the small room. It was an office, was frozen in time. In the center of the room stood a heavy wooden desk, its surface completely obscured by a thick, velvety blanket of dust. Behind it, a leather office chair had rotted away, its stuffing spilling out onto the floor like dried entrails. On the wall, a calendar hung askew, the pages yellowed and brittle. The picture was of a soaring eagle, and the month was May 1979. He felt a dizzying sense of temporal dislocation. This room had been breathing a different air, sealed off from the world for longer than he had been alive. The silence was absolute, insulated by the thick brick wall from the howling wind outside. It was the heavy, weighted silence of a place that held a long dormant secret. He moved toward the desk, the small flame of his lighter, his only guide. He ran his finger across its surface, leaving a clean, dark trail in the thick dust. It felt like sacrilege, like disturbing a sacred burial site. He tried the drawers of the desk, pulling on the brass handles. They were all unlocked, but they were all empty, every single one. Whoever had sealed this room had cleared out the desk first, or the important things had never been kept in the desk at all. He scanned the small room again. It was Spartan, just the desk, the ruined chair, and a single, rusted filing cabinet against the wall. He checked the cabinet, also empty. A cold knot of disappointment began to form in his stomach. Was this it? A hidden, empty room, a pointless secret. It didn't make any sense. Why go to all this trouble to hide nothing? His gaze fell from the walls to the floor, covered in the same thick, uniform layer of dust. He stomped his foot on the floorboards, his bad leg sending a sharp protest up to his hip. The sound was a dull thud. He remembered stories about his grandfather, a man known for his cleverness and his paranoia, a builder who knew that the best hiding places were often the most obvious ones. He began to walk the small space deliberately, testing the floor with every step. He put his weight on each board, listening, feeling for any give, any variation from the solid feel of the rest of the floor. Thud, thud, thud. The floor felt solid, ancient and immovable. He was about to give up, to write this off as another dead end in a life full of them, when he stepped on a board right beside the desk. It didn't creak or groan. It shifted, a tiny, almost imperceptible movement downward, accompanied by a soft puff of dust from the seams. His breath caught in his chest. He dropped to his knees, ignoring the sharp pain, his heart pounding a frantic rhythm. His fingers, raw and scraped, scrabbled at the edges of the floorboard. He couldn't get a purchase. The board was fit too perfectly. He took out his wrench, the tool that had become the key to unlocking this place, and wedged the thin end into the crack. He pried gently at first, then with more force. The old hand-forged nails holding the board in place resisted for a moment, then began to pull free with a sighing groan of stressed wood. The sound was excruciatingly loud in the dead silence of the office. He worked the wrench around the edges, slowly, carefully, loosening the board from its long slumber. Finally, with a last, splintering protest, the board came free. He lifted it away, his hands trembling with a mixture of exertion and anticipation. Beneath it was not dirt or joists, but a perfectly cut, dark, rectangular void, a hidden compartment, and nestled snugly inside it, its dark green metal glinting in the flickering lighter flame, was a heavy-looking footlocker. He stared at it for a long moment, his mind struggling to process what he was seeing. A hidden room, a hidden compartment, a locked metal box. This was a chain of secrets, each link forged with purpose and desperation. This box was the heart of the mystery. He reached into the compartment and tried to lift it. It was incredibly heavy, far heavier than an empty box should be. He couldn't get enough leverage to pull it out of the tight space. He would have to open it here in this dusty tomb. The footlocker was secured with a thick, heavy padlock, a solid, pitted mass of orange and brown rust. It looked as if it had been fused shut by the passage of 4 decades. He knew without trying that there was no key, There was only one way this was going to open. He set the lighter down on the edge of the compartment, its small flame providing a meager, unsteady light. He took the heavy wrench and struck the padlock with all his might. The impact resulted in a loud, metallic clang that reverberated through the tiny office and seemed to shake the very dust in the air. The lock held firm, a small dent the only evidence of his effort. He hit it again and again, the rhythmic, violent sounds, a stark contrast to the years of silence. Sweat beaded on his forehead, mingling with the grime. His frustration grew with every blow. The lock was mocking him. He looked around the dark office, his eyes falling on a length of thick steel rebar left over from some long-forgotten construction. An idea formed. He wedged one end of the rebar through the shackle of the lock and propped the other end on a broken piece of concrete block he found in the corner, creating a crude, powerful lever. He put his foot on the box to hold it steady and threw his entire weight down on the end of the rebar. The metal shrieked in protest, a high-pitched, grinding scream of torture. He pushed harder, his muscles straining, his teeth gritted. The rebar began to bend under the immense pressure. He was pouring all his frustration, his fear for Mia, his anger at the world into this single, violent act. He roared with effort, and suddenly, with a deafening snap that echoed like a gunshot, the rusted hasp of the lock shattered. The rebar clattered to the floor. The footlocker was open. Silence rushed back in, thick and absolute. He knelt before the box, his breath coming in ragged gasps. His hands were shaking uncontrollably now. This was it, the culmination of his desperate search. For a wild moment, his mind filled with fantasies, gold bars, stacks of cash, jewels, a treasure that could solve all their problems, that could buy Mia a warm bed, a doctor, a future. It had to be. After everything they had been through, it had to be their salvation, locked away and waiting for him. With a trembling hand, he reached out and lifted the heavy lid of the footlocker. It opened with a low, resonant groan, the sound of a tomb giving up its secrets. He peered inside, his eyes straining in the dim, flickering light from his lighter, his heart ready for the brilliant shine of gold or the neat, green stacks of a hidden fortune. But he saw nothing of the sort. His heart plummeted. The box was full, but not with treasure. It was filled to the brim with paper. Dozens of bundles of documents tied with faded red string, several thick, leather-bound books that looked like ledgers or journals, and stacks of letters in brittle, yellowed envelopes. A bitter, suffocating wave of disappointment washed over him. It was just paper, worthless, old paper. After all this, the light, the wall, the lock, it was all for nothing. Another dead end, another false hope. He felt the energy drain out of him, leaving him hollow and defeated once more. He slumped against the desk, the dust puffing up around him. Just paper. The words echoed in his mind, a mantra of failure. But as he stared into the open box, his initial disappointment began to fade, replaced by a reluctant curiosity. He leaned closer. This wasn't just random paper. The books were clearly journals, their dark leather covers embossed with initials. A.V. Arthur Vance, his grandfather. The thicker stacks of paper were not junk mail, they were property deeds, heavy parchment covered in dense, legal script and affixed with embossed seals and faded blue ink signatures. The smell rising from the box was potent, the dry, faintly sweet and dusty scent of old archives, a smell that spoke of history and secrets. He reached in and picked up one of the leather journals. The paper wasn't their salvation, not in the way he'd hoped. He was beginning to realize it was something else entirely, something much more complicated. He carefully opened the top journal, the leather cool and surprisingly supple under his calloused fingers. The pages were filled with a tight, angry script, the ink slightly faded but still perfectly legible. His eyes fell on a random entry halfway through the book. The words seemed to leap off the page, charged with a 4-decade-old rage. "Cole is a devil in a tailored suit," his grandfather had written. He preys on the weak because he knows they cannot fight back. Today he forced the Martinez family off the land their people have farmed for 100 years, and he did it with a sheaf of fraudulent papers and a threat to have their son arrested. My own name is on that paperwork. God forgive me. Leo's blood ran cold. He flipped through the pages, seeing other family names he recognized, names from the poor, rural outskirts of the city. It was a detailed chronicle of a crime, He set the journal aside and picked up one of the thick stacks of property deeds. Untying the brittle string that held it together, he unrolled the top document. It was a deed for a massive parcel of farmland, hundreds of acres of what was now prime real estate, on the edge of the city's sprawl. The document certified the sale of the land from a family named Peterson to a newly formed partnership. He scanned down to the bottom of the page, to the signatures of the new owners. The first was his grandfather's, Arthur Vance. The second name, written in a confident, elegant script, was Arthur Cole. The name was vaguely familiar, but he couldn't place it. He rolled up the deed and looked at the others, dozens of them, all for huge tracts of land, all signed over to the same partnership. It was a blueprint for a hostile takeover, a systematic acquisition of an entire region. He then turned to the bundles of letters. He opened one of the envelopes, the paper so brittle it threatened to crumble in his hands. The letter was from his grandfather, and it was addressed to his partner, Arthur Cole. It was not a friendly correspondence. The pages were filled with frantic arguments, recriminations, and a palpable sense of growing panic. "What we have done is a sin, Arthur," one passage read. "These are good people, and we have ruined them. I can't live with it." He picked up another letter, dated several months later. The tone was even more desperate. "I will not have this blood on my hands. I am compiling all the records, every deed, every threat. I am going to the district attorney. This ends now." The date on the letter was October 22nd, 1979. Leo remembered the date on his grandfather's death certificate, a document he had found among his mother's things. A sudden, massive heart attack. October 24th, 1979. 2 days after this letter was written, a shiver traced its way down his spine. Tucked into the side of the footlocker, almost hidden beneath a stack of deeds, was a strange, homemade contraption. It was a small wooden box holding a large E-cylindrical battery, the kind used in old industrial flashlights. Wires, their insulation cracking with age, ran from the battery to a single, bare light bulb. It was a simple, crude circuit, a silent alarm. He traced the wires with his finger and saw that one of them was attached to a small pressure switch, positioned to sit directly beneath the hidden floorboard. The realization hit him like a physical shock. The light he and Mia had seen hadn't been a ghost. It was the last dying gasp of this 40-year-old battery, the circuit finally shorting out or making a final, weak connection. It was a signal from the grave, a desperate, electronic cry for help from a dead man, rigged to draw attention to this very spot. Leo sat back on his heels, the cold of the concrete floor seeping into his bones, though he barely felt it. A dizzying, terrifying clarity washed over him. This box didn't contain a simple fortune. It contained something infinitely more valuable and infinitely more dangerous. It was proof, irrefutable, documented proof of a massive criminal conspiracy, a story of theft, intimidation, and likely murder, orchestrated to steal land from the poor and powerless, and at the center of it all, the man his grandfather was about to expose, the partner whose name was on every document, was Arthur Cole. The name finally clicked into place with sickening certainty. Judge Arthur Cole, the benevolent, powerful, untouchable patriarch of the city, a man whose face was on statues and library wings. Leo wasn't holding the key to his family's salvation. He was holding a bomb, and the fuse was now lit. The small sealed office became Leo's entire world. The flickering flame of his lighter cast long, dancing shadows as he devoured the contents of the footlocker, his hunger for food forgotten, replaced by a desperate hunger for the truth. He sat on the dusty floor, the heavy leather journal open in his lap, its pages brittle and smelling of time itself. His grandfather's handwriting was a revelation, each angry, tightly formed word a conduit to the past. "Cole did it again," one entry screamed from the page, dated June 1978. He found a loophole in the water rights, something no one but a lawyer could understand. He told the old widow Miller that her farm would be dust by summer unless she sold. He offered her pennies. When she refused, he reminded her that her son had a bit of a temper, and that misunderstandings with the law could be permanent. "My name is on the document that starves her. The ink feels like acid on my skin." Leo felt a wave of nausea. He could almost smell the cloying sweetness of Cole's lies, feel the cold terror of the families he broke. He pushed the journal aside, and unrolled one of the thick bundles of deeds. The heavy parchment was covered in dense, arcane legal script, but the names were horrifyingly clear. Peterson, Garcia, O'Connell, Rodriguez, dozens of families, all signing away vast tracts of ancestral land for pittances recorded in the margins. $500, $1,000, sometimes just the forgiveness of a fabricated debt. And on every single document, the buyers were the same: Arthur Vance and Arthur Cole. Leo felt a sickening sense of recognition. These stolen lands weren't distant, forgotten fields anymore. He knew these areas. They were now the city's most affluent suburbs, gated communities and sprawling golf courses, places he had once driven past with a dull ache of envy. His grandfather's guilt was a ghost haunting the margins of every page. "I built him an empire of dirt and tears," he had scrawled at the bottom of one deed, "and he built his throne on top of it. What have I done? What have I become for him?" This was a confession. The letters were the most damning part of the discovery. They were a one-sided conversation, a monologue of a man's descent into a private hell of his own making. "You call it business, Arthur. I call it theft," his grandfather wrote in one. The paper creased as if it had been crumpled into a ball and then smoothed out again. "These are people's lives, not assets on a balance sheet. You have taken everything from them, and now you want to erase them completely." Another, dated weeks later, was filled with a palpable panic. "I saw what your men did to that farmer who tried to speak to the newspaper. I will not be a party to violence. This partnership is over. I am keeping my copies of everything. Every deed, every contract, every note. I am giving it all to the authorities. This has to stop. And if I have to burn myself to the ground to do it, so be it." Leo's hand trembled as he read the date on the final, most desperate letter, October 22nd, 1979. "A heart attack," they had said. Just 2 days later, the air in the office felt thick, suffocating, heavy with the silent scream of a 40-year-old murder. Leo spent the next few days in a fugue state, a man possessed. He barely ate the meager rations he had left, his body running on a feverish cocktail of adrenaline and horror. The footlocker became his altar, the documents his scripture. He pieced the story together, cross-referencing names from the journal with the deeds, tracing the timeline of the land grab and his grandfather's descent into guilt-ridden paranoia. He now understood the hidden room, the alarm, the desperate hope that someone would one day find this box. It was his grandfather's only path to redemption, a message in a bottle thrown into the ocean of time. He felt the immense, terrifying weight of this legacy settle upon his shoulders. He was no longer just a failed father trying to survive. He was the sole heir to a crime, the custodian of a truth that could shatter the city's foundations. Outside the hidden door, Mia's rattling cough was a constant, painful reminder of the real world, of the stakes that grew higher with every document he read. It was the sound that broke the spell. A low crunch of tires on gravel, alien and intrusive in the desolate landscape of the industrial park. It was a sound that did not belong here. It wasn't the rumble of a junker or the heavy tread of a delivery truck. It was the quiet, confident hiss of expensive rubber on stone. Leo's heart seized in his chest, a cold, hard knot of fear. He scrambled from the hidden office, his bad legs screaming in protest, and peered through a jagged crack in the filthy brick wall of the main warehouse. The morning light was flat and grey, casting a pall over the scene, but there was no mistaking what he saw. A long, black sedan hill polished to a mirror shine that seemed to absorb the light around it had pulled to a stop 50 yards from the warehouse entrance. It was a car that represented a different universe, a world of power and wealth so far removed from his own that its presence here felt like a violation, an invasion from another reality. His mouth went dry. He knew, with a certainty that chilled him to the bone, who was coming. A man in a black suit and cap, clearly a chauffeur, emerged from the driver's side. He moved with an efficient, practiced grace, walking around to the rear passenger door and opening it with a respectful dip of his head. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, a single, polished black shoe was placed on the gravel. It was followed by a frail, elderly man who levered himself out of the car with the help of a silver-headed cane. He was perhaps 80 years old. His body stooped and thin inside a perfectly tailored wool overcoat. He stood for a moment, surveying the colossal, rusted ruin of the warehouse, his posture ramrod straight despite his age. The wind whipped at his coat, but he seemed utterly impervious to the cold. Leo's blood turned to ice water in his veins. He had seen that face 100 times in his life, on the news, on the bronze plaques of donated library wings, in old photographs from the city's archives. It was Judge Arthur Cole, the partner, the devil in a tailored suit, the architect of all this pain. Cole dismissed his driver with a slight flick of his hand and began to walk towards the warehouse. He moved slowly, his cane making a soft, rhythmic tap-tap-tap on the frozen ground. His steps were not the tentative movements of a frail old man. They were the deliberate, measured paces of a predator who knows he owns the territory. He scanned the building, his gaze sweeping over the collapsed roof, the shattered windows, the peeling paint. His expression was not one of distaste, but of cold, calculating assessment. It was the look of a man appraising an asset, a problem to be managed. Leo felt a surge of primal fear, the terror of a mouse watching a hawk circle overhead. He was trapped. The warehouse, his supposed fortress, had become a cage, and the monster from his grandfather's nightmares was walking slowly, inexorably, towards the door. He instinctively backed away from the crack in the wall, his heart hammering a frantic, desperate rhythm against his ribs. Cole didn't even try the main entrance. He walked with an unnerving confidence directly to the small, bent service door that Leo and Mia had used, as if he knew it would be their point of entry. The door screeched open, and Cole stepped inside, pausing for a moment as his eyes adjusted to the gloom. He seemed to take in the entire scene in a sweeping glance, the pathetic lean-to of cardboard, the scattered debris, the sheer scale of the dereliction, and then his eyes, pale and shockingly sharp, landed on Leo. For a long moment, the two men stood in silence, separated by 100 feet of cold, debris-strewn concrete. The contrast was absolute, a tableau of the city's extremes. Leo, covered in grime, his clothes ragged, his body thrumming with fear and rage. Cole, immaculate, composed, radiating an aura of untouchable power that seemed to warp the very air around him. The old man smiled, a thin, bloodless stretching of his lips that did not reach his eyes. "You must be Mr. Vance," he said, his voice surprisingly strong. The voice was smooth, cultured, and laced with a condescending warmth that made Leo's skin crawl. "Arthur Cole," the old man said, extending a gloved hand as if they were meeting at a garden party. Leo didn't move. Cole simply lowered his hand, his smile never faltering. "I understand you've taken up residence here. A bit rustic, wouldn't you say?" His eyes swept the squalor with amusement. "I am the head of a community development board. We're looking to acquire some of these old industrial properties. This one, in particular, it's a blight on the landscape, an eyesore. We plan to demolish it and build something new, something that will benefit the whole city." He spoke of demolition and renewal, but his eyes were fixed on Leo, probing, searching. He was not here to negotiate. He was here to gauge his enemy. "Of course," Cole continued, "the property is legally yours, a strange little inheritance. We would need to purchase it from you. It is, of course, worthless in its current state, a liability." In fact, Leo's mind was a maelstrom of terror and fury. He said nothing, his silence a shield against the old man's suffocating presence. The journal, the deeds, the letters, they were all burning a hole in his mind. This man, this pillar of the community, was a thief and a murderer, and he was standing right in front of him, cloaked in the invulnerable armor of wealth and reputation. "We are prepared to make you an offer, Mr. Vance," Cole said. Reaching into his overcoat, he produced a long white envelope, a gesture of goodwill to help you get back on your feet. $10,000. He let the number hang in the frigid air. $10,000. To Leo, who was down to his last few dollars, it should have sounded like a fortune, but knowing what he knew, knowing that the land Cole had stolen was now worth hundreds of millions, the offer was a profound insult. It was a crumb thrown from a king's table, a pittance meant to underscore his own powerlessness and Leo's utter insignificance. Cole held the envelope out, but Leo made no move to take it. The judge's eyes narrowed ever so slightly, the first crack in his placid facade. "It is a more than generous offer for a pile of rust and rubble," he said. his voice losing a fraction of its warmth. "A man in your position should be grateful. A chance to start over. A warm place for your family." At the mention of family, Cole's gaze drifted pointedly towards the corner where Mia was hidden, bundled in her nest of blankets, a small, barely visible lump in the shadows. A visible, rattling cough escaped the bundle, cutting through the silence. Cole's thin smile returned, but this time it was chilling, predatory. His eyes locked back onto Leo's. "These old buildings," he said softly, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial murmur. "They are so very dangerous, unstable, prone to accidents." He let the word hang in the air, heavy with unspoken meaning. The temperature in the warehouse seemed to drop another 10 degrees. "Structural collapses, for instance," Cole continued, his gaze unwavering. "A section of roof could give way at any moment. Or a fire. It's so easy for a fire to start in a place like this, with squatters trying to keep warm. It would be a tragedy. A terrible, terrible tragedy." Each word was carefully chosen. A polished stone dropped into a deep, dark well. He wasn't just talking about a building anymore. He was talking about them. He was painting a picture of their deaths, framing it as a sad but unavoidable accident. Leo felt a cold sweat break out on his forehead, his heart hammering so hard he thought it would burst from his chest. The sheer audacity of the man was breathtaking. He was threatening to murder him and his daughter, while simultaneously offering him hush money, all without raising his voice, all while maintaining the serene, benevolent mask of a community leader. This wasn't a negotiation. It was a death threat delivered with a smile. The air crackled with a silent, violent tension. Cole took a slow step forward, his silver-headed cane tapping once on the concrete. The sound was like a judge's gavel. "Think about the offer, Mr. Vance. Think about what is best for your little girl." He glanced again towards Mia's corner. Darn, it would be a shame for such a young life to be cut short by a simple mistake. A misplaced candle, a support beam weakened by rust. He finally placed the envelope on a nearby oil drum, pushing it gently towards Leo. "I will be in touch." He then turned, his movements slow and deliberate, and walked back towards the door without a single glance back. He had delivered his message. He knew Leo had the documents. He had shown him the choice: take the money and disappear, or stay and be erased. The heavy service door groaned shut behind him, plunging the warehouse back into its familiar gloom, but the atmosphere had been irrevocably changed. The space was no longer just desolate, it was now thick with the promise of violence, a ticking time bomb. The sound of the black sedan's engine starting up and fading into the distance was the loudest thing Leo had ever heard. He was left alone, trembling in the vast, cold emptiness of the warehouse, his body shaking with a mixture of terror and white-hot rage. The white envelope sat on the oil drum, a $10,000 surrender, a bribe for his silence, a down payment on his daughter's life. He looked from the envelope to the dark corner where Mia lay coughing, her small, fragile life now a bargaining chip in a 40-year-old war. He then looked towards the hidden office, towards the footlocker full of secrets, the heavy burden of truth his grandfather had passed on to him. He could take the money, run, and maybe buy them a few months of safety, or he could stay and fight this monster, risking an accident that would bury them and the truth forever. The weight of the choice was crushing, a physical pressure on his chest, and as he stood there, paralyzed by the impossible decision, "We have to ask you, what would you do in his place?" The judge's threat hung in the frigid air long after the sound of his car had faded, a toxic vapor that settled deep in Leo's lungs. He stood frozen, the $10,000 envelope on the oil drum seeming to pulse with a malevolent energy. It was blood money, a price tag on his and Mia's silence and on their very lives. The warehouse, once a symbol of crushing failure, now felt like a tomb waiting to be sealed. The cold he felt was no longer from the wind whistling through the broken windows. It was a deep, internal freeze of pure terror. Cole hadn't been guessing. He knew. He knew about the documents, about the secrets Leo had unearthed. This wasn't a random visit. It was the opening move in a war Leo was terrifyingly unprepared to fight. He looked over at the small bundle of blankets where Mia lay sleeping, her cough a fragile, rhythmic counterpoint to the pounding of his own heart. Cole's words echoed in his mind, a venomous whisper. It would be a tragedy. It wasn't a warning. It was a promise. He had to run. But where? His mind raced, a frantic scramble for options in a world that had offered him none. The police, he scoffed internally, a bitter, soundless laugh. What would he say? That the most powerful man in the city, the venerable Judge Cole, had threatened him in a derelict warehouse. They would think he was insane, a desperate squatter trying to extort money. They would take Mia away from him and throw him in a cell while Cole's network erased every trace of the problem. He felt a profound, suffocating isolation. He was a ghost, a non-person, fighting a king. He had the truth in a metal box, but the truth was useless if he was dead. He needed help, an ally. But who would believe him? Who would dare to stand against Arthur Cole? His gaze drifted towards the front of the warehouse, towards the service road. He remembered, on the desolate drive, in seeing a single flicker of life in the urban decay, a small, grimy window, faintly lit, a dusty shop, seemingly out of place and out of time, a clockmaker's shop. It was nothing, but it was also everything. The decision was a spark in the overwhelming darkness. It was a mad, desperate gamble, but it was better than waiting for the fire. He moved with a new, frantic purpose. He carefully retrieved the envelope from the oil drum, not to keep but as evidence of the bribe. He then returned to the hidden office, his movements swift despite the agonizing throb in his leg. He couldn't carry the entire footlocker. It was too heavy, too conspicuous. He had to choose the most vital piece of the puzzle, the one thing that could lend his insane story a sliver of credibility. He chose his grandfather's primary journal, the one that detailed the beginning of the conspiracy and the depths of Cole's evil. He tucked it inside his worn jacket, its hard leather spine a comfort against his ribs. He then went to Mia's corner. "Mia, sweetie," he whispered, gently shaking her. "We have to go. We're going to visit someone." She stirred, her eyes fluttering open. Clouded with sleep and fever, the trust in them was a knife in his heart. Stepping out of the warehouse felt like leaping from a sinking ship into a frozen ocean. The wind was a physical assault, tearing at their clothes and stealing their breath. Leo carried Mia, her small, frail body wrapped in a blanket, her head resting on his shoulder. Her cough was worse now, a deep barking sound that echoed in the desolate emptiness of the industrial park. Each cough sent a fresh wave of panic through him. He walked as fast as his injured leg would allow, his limp more pronounced under the strain. He kept to the shadows of the rusted, abandoned factories, his eyes scanning every dark corner, every shattered window. He felt naked, exposed, a target in a vast shooting gallery. The rhythmic tap of Cole's cane seemed to echo in his ears, a phantom sound promising imminent violence. The black sedan could be around any corner, its headlights a harbinger of the end. The journal in his jacket felt like it weighed 100 pounds, a burden of truth that could either save them or get them killed. The clock shop was even more forlorn up close. It was a narrow, two-story brick building squeezed between two much larger, derelict warehouses. The sign above the door was so faded and weather-beaten that the words "Silas Clocks and Repair" were barely legible, like a secret whispered from a bygone era. The display window was covered in a thick, opaque layer of grime, revealing nothing of the interior except for the faint, warm glow he had seen from the road. It looked less like a functioning business and more like a museum exhibit on urban decay. For a moment, his courage failed him. He was about to turn a complete stranger's life upside down with his catastrophic story. The man inside, whoever he was, would likely throw him out into the cold, thinking him a madman. But the memory of Cole's face, the dead, predatory eyes, pushed him forward. He took a deep, shuddering breath, the frigid air burning his lungs, shifted Mia's weight, and reached for the tarnished brass doorknob. The door opened with a sigh of ancient wood and the cheerful chime of a small brass bell. The sound was so out of place in this world of rust and ruin that it was startling. He stepped inside and was immediately enveloped by a wall of warm, dry air and a symphony of gentle, rhythmic sound. Ticking. Hundreds of clocks, all ticking in a soft, overlapping chorus that was strangely soothing. The air smelled of old wood, brass polish, and lubricating oil. It was the scent of patience and precision. The shop was a cavern of organized chaos, every available surface covered with clocks of all shapes and sizes. Grandfather clocks stood like silent sentinels along the walls, their pendulums swinging in hypnotic unison. Shelves overflowed with mantel clocks, cuckoo clocks, and intricate, delicate mechanisms under glass domes. It was a world entirely separate from the one he had just left, a pocket of time that had stopped moving forward somewhere around 1950, content to simply measure its own passing. From behind a tall counter cluttered with tiny tools, magnifying glasses, and dissected clockworks, a figure straightened up slowly. It was an old man, smaller and more hunched than Leo had expected. He wore a thick leather apron over a flannel shirt and had a jeweler's loupe pushed up on his forehead. His face was a roadmap of wrinkles. His eyes, magnified by thick spectacles, were sharp and intelligent. He peered at Leo and the bundled-up child in his arms with an expression of profound suspicion, his gaze lingering on Leo's grimy clothes and the desperation etched onto his face. The ticking of the clock seemed to grow louder, filling the silence between them. "We're closed," the man said, his voice a dry, dusty rasp, as if it hadn't been used in days. He made no move to come out from behind the counter. He just stood there, a small, wary creature in his den of gears and springs, clearly wanting nothing more than for this intrusion from the outside world to go away. "Please," Leo's voice cracked, raw with cold and fear. "I need your help." "My name is Leo Vance." He said the name deliberately, a key he hoped might unlock something. The old man, Silas, showed no reaction. "I don't know you," he stated flatly, his eyes narrowing. "This isn't a shelter. Whatever trouble you're in, take it somewhere else." He began to turn away, a clear dismissal. Desperation surged through Leo, hot and sharp. "It's about Arthur Cole," he blurted out, the name feeling like a curse on his tongue. Silas froze, his back still to Leo. The change was instantaneous and electric. The old man's shoulders went rigid. For a full 10 seconds, the only sound in the shop was the relentless, unified ticking of the clocks. It was the sound of 100 tiny hearts beating in unison, counting down the seconds of a life. Slowly, Silas turned back around. The wary suspicion in his eyes had been replaced by something else entirely, a deep, ancient, and unmistakable fear. Leo knew he had one chance. He couldn't explain the whole convoluted story of the warehouse, the footlocker, the decades of crime. It was too much, too insane. He had to show him. He carefully shifted Mia in his arms, reached inside his jacket, and pulled out the heavy leather journal. He held it out, his hand trembling. "My grandfather," Leo said, his voice barely a whisper. His name was Arthur Vance. This was his... He placed the journal on the cluttered counter, pushing it across the dusty surface towards the old clockmaker. Silas stared at the book, as if it were a coiled snake. His own hands, stained with oil and surprisingly steady, hovered over the dark leather cover for a moment before he reached out and touched it, his fingertips tracing the embossed initials. A.V. He didn't need to open it. His face, already a mask of wrinkles, seemed to collapse inward. The blood drained from his cheeks, leaving his skin the color of old parchment. The fear in his eyes was now mingled with a profound, soul-deep sorrow. "I haven't seen this in 40 years, Silas whispered, his voice catching. He finally opened the book, his eyes scanning the angry, familiar script. He looked up at Leo, and for the first time, his gaze held no suspicion, only a shared, terrible understanding. "You're his grandson," he said, not as a question, but as a statement of dreadful fact. He gestured to a rickety wooden chair near the pot-bellied stove in the corner. "Sit. Put the child down. She's burning with fever." The command was soft, but it carried an authority that hadn't been there before. The wall of suspicion had crumbled, replaced by a weary resignation. The posture of a man finally facing a ghost he had been running from for his entire adult life. Leo sank into the chair, his exhausted body screaming with relief. He gently laid Mia on a small cot Silas pointed to, tucking the thin blanket around her. The warmth from the stove was a blessing, a small circle of sanctuary in a world gone cold. The ticking of the clocks seemed to fade into a background hum. Silas poured 2 glasses of whiskey from a dusty bottle with shaking hands, pushing one towards Leo. "I knew this day would come," he began, his voice a low, mournful rasp. "I prayed it wouldn't, but I always knew." He took a long swallow of his drink. "I was a boy when I started working for him. For Cole, I was his clerk, eager, ambitious, and too stupid to understand what I was really doing." He looked at the journal on the counter, his expression one of self-loathing. I typed them, all of them. The fraudulent deeds, the foreclosure notices based on fabricated debts, the threatening letters. My fingers were the instruments of his theft. I was the one who made the lies look legal. He let out a dry, humorless laugh that turned into a cough. He paid me well, told me it was just business. The sharp-elbowed nature of progress, he called it. He could make any sin sound like a virtue, and I was young enough and poor enough to believe him. Your grandfather's Arthur, Silas continued, his gaze distant, lost in the labyrinth of memory. He was different. He had a conscience. At first, he was caught up in it. In the money, the power, the sheer thrill of building an empire from nothing. Cole could be very persuasive, charming even, when he wanted to be. He sold your grandfather on a vision of the future, a modern city rising from the dirt, but your grandfather couldn't ignore the faces. I would see him after a family had been forced out. He would come back to the office, his face pale, his hands shaking. He started drinking heavily. He started arguing with Cole, first in private, then openly. He called it what it was, theft, evil. Silas ran a hand over his face, the gesture infinitely weary. I was the one who had to file the paperwork, you see. I saw every transaction. I saw the fortune they were amassing, and I saw the misery they were leaving in their wake. Your grandfather's guilt was eating him alive. Cole's ambition, however, was endless. Cole was a shark, Silas said, his voice dropping to a near whisper, as if afraid the name itself could still summon the man. He fed on fear. He knew every weakness, every pressure point. If a family had a son with a gambling problem, suddenly a debt would be called in. If a man had a past mistake, a word to a friendly police chief could bring it all back. Cole orchestrated it all with the precision of a watchmaker. He was building a kingdom, and the law was just another tool, like a hammer or a screwdriver. Your grandfather saw this. He saw the violence simmering just beneath the surface of the legal threats. The men Cole kept on his private payroll weren't lawyers. They were thugs, men who knew how to break things, windows, contracts, bones. Arthur Vance wanted to build something. Arthur Cole wanted to own everything, and he was willing to destroy anyone who stood in his way. The partnership was doomed from the start. It was a partnership between a man and a monster. Towards the end, your grandfather was a wreck, Silas recalled, staring into his empty glass. He was documenting everything, just like you found. He was building a case. He told me he was going to burn it all down, even if he went to prison himself. He said he couldn't live with the ghosts of the families he'd helped ruin. Silas's eyes met Leo's, and the fear was back, sharp and fresh. The week he died, he was scheduled to meet with the State Attorney General. He told me. He had a copy of the Foot Locker's contents ready to go. The day before his meeting, he had a final, terrible argument with Cole right in the office. I was in the next room. I heard everything. The shouting, a table being overturned, your grandfather yelling, "I will not let you get away with murder, Arthur." Then a crash, a heavy, sickening sound. Silence. Silas shuddered, the memory still raw after 40 years. He pushed himself away from the counter, his knuckles white. Cole came out of the office alone, Silas whispered, his voice trembling uncontrollably. His suit wasn't even rumpled. He just straightened his tie and looked at me. His eyes were empty, like a doll's eyes. He said, "Arthur isn't feeling well. He's gone home to rest." Just like that. 2 days later, the papers said he'd had a massive heart attack. A tragedy. Everyone at the firm, everyone who knew what was going on, we all knew. We knew Cole had killed him. A heart attack can be induced. Cole had friends, doctors who owed him favors. It was a perfect, clean murder. No proof, no witnesses willing to talk. I was 20 years old. I had a family. I was terrified. So I kept my mouth shut. I quit my job the next week, and I bought this shop. I hid. I've been hiding in here ever since, just waiting for him to die or for this day to come. The confession hung in the air, a story of murder and cowardice that had festered in the silence of the ticking clocks for 4 decades. The old clockmaker's story settled over Leo, a shroud of terrible final clarity. The last piece of the puzzle clicked into place, not with a satisfying snap, but with the sickening crunch of bone. His grandfather hadn't just been betrayed, he had been murdered, silenced by the very man whose empire he had helped to build. The phantom light in the warehouse, the hidden room, the Foot Locker. It was all the desperate, final act of a man who knew he was about to be killed. He had been trying to leave behind a weapon for a future avenger he could only pray would one day arrive. And now, that responsibility, that terrible weight, rested squarely on Leo's shoulders. He was no longer just a victim of circumstance. He was a key witness in a 40-year-old murder case, holding the very evidence the killer believed had died with his grandfather. His own fear was suddenly dwarfed by the enormity of his new purpose. He wasn't just fighting for Mia's future anymore, he was fighting for his grandfather's stolen justice. Silas looked at Leo, his eyes filled with a mixture of terror and resolve. "You cannot go back to that warehouse," he said, his voice regaining a sliver of its strength. "Now that Cole has shown his hand, he will not wait. The $10,000 wasn't an offer, it was a final courtesy. When you didn't take it, you signed your own death warrant. He won't risk another heart attack. Not now, he'll be cruder. A fire, a building collapse, something that erases you and the evidence completely. Tonight, he will send his men, tonight." The certainty in the old man's voice was absolute. He had been studying his monster for 40 years. He knew exactly how it would hunt. You have the proof he thinks he buried forever. You are the one loose end in a life built on secrets and violence. He will not, cannot, let you survive the night. The warmth of the stove suddenly felt like a lie, a temporary reprieve before being cast back out into a storm of unimaginable violence. A new energy surged through Leo, an alloy of fear and righteous fury. He was no longer just a desperate father. He was a soldier in a war declared long before he was born. "I have to get the rest of it," Leo said, his voice hard. "The deeds, the letters, the footlocker, it's all still there." Silas nodded grimly. "Then you must be quick and you must be clever. Cole's men won't be thinkers. They will be thugs, sent to do a simple, brutal job. Use their brute force against them. You need a head start. You need a diversion." The old clockmaker's mind, accustomed to the intricate dance of gears and springs, was now working on a different kind of mechanism, a mechanism of survival. This industrial park has a network of old service tunnels, mostly collapsed, but I know one that runs from behind the old cannery to the rail line. It's a mile from here. Meet me there, at the third ventilation shaft. Be ready to run, and for God's sake, do not get caught. He drew a crude map on a dusty scrap of paper, his hand surprisingly steady. Leo committed the map to memory, the simple lines a lifeline in a sea of chaos. He looked over at Mia, still sleeping, her face flushed with fever. Taking her back into that death trap was an unthinkable risk, but leaving her was impossible. She was the reason he was fighting. He had to get in, get the box, and get out before Cole's men arrived. Thank you," he said to Silas, the words feeling utterly inadequate. The old man just shook his head, his face grim. "Don't thank me. I am a coward who has been hiding for 40 years. Your grandfather was the brave one. He tried to do the right thing and paid for it with his life. Don't let his sacrifice be for nothing. Now go, and pray you are faster than his demons." With a final shared look of grim understanding, Leo gently scooped up Mia, wrapping her fragile, warm body tightly in the blanket. He stepped back out of the warm, ticking sanctuary of the shop, the chime of the bell behind him a farewell, and plunged back into the cold, hostile reality of the dying day. The walk back to the warehouse was a journey into the heart of fear. Every shadow seemed to move. Every gust of wind sounded like a footstep. The setting sun painted the sky in bruised shades of orange and purple, casting long, menacing shadows that stretched like grasping fingers across the cracked pavement. Leo held Mia close, her warmth a small, precious ember against the encroaching night. He was no longer just fleeing the cold. He was walking willingly into a trap, hoping to spring it and escape before its jaws snapped shut. When he reached the warehouse, he didn't use the service door. He circled around to the back, to a section of the corrugated metal wall he had noticed was loose, held on by only a few rusted bolts. He worked them free with his wrench, creating a narrow, jagged opening. This would be their escape route. He slipped inside, the familiar stench of decay, now laced with the metallic tang of imminent violence. The vast, dark space felt electric with tension, a stage set for a final, bloody act. He worked with a feverish, silent intensity. He retrieved the heavy footlocker from the hidden office, the metal cold and solid in his hands. It was the physical manifestation of his grandfather's legacy, a 40-pound anchor of truth. He dragged it across the concrete floor to their escape route near the back wall, his bad leg a fiery agony he forced himself to ignore. He bundled Mia into a small sheltered nook he had prepared, a hollowed-out space within a pile of collapsed pallets, hidden from the main lines of sight. "Stay here and stay quiet, no matter what you hear," he whispered, his heart breaking at the fear in her wide eyes. "I'll be right back for you." He then turned his attention to his diversion. His eyes fell on a towering, unstable stack of rusted steel shelves, laden with decades of hardened bags of cement and other debris. It stood precariously close to the main entrance, a disaster waiting to happen. It was perfect, a homemade avalanche. He waited in the darkness, his body taut as a drawn bowstring, every sense screaming. The warehouse was unnervingly silent, the wind having died down. All he could hear was the frantic pounding of his own heart and Mia's soft, shallow breaths from her hiding place. Time seemed to slow down, each second stretching into an eternity. He crouched near the base of the precarious shelving unit, his hand resting on one of its rusted supports, his body coiled like a spring. He was a hunter now, waiting for the predators to enter his trap. He thought of his grandfather's last violent argument, the sound of a crash that Silas had described. He was about to create an echo of that sound, a roar of defiance that would hopefully buy him the seconds he needed to live. The fear was still there, a cold, hard knot in his stomach, but it was now overlaid with a diamond-hard layer of resolve. He would not let his family's story end here, in fire and ash. The sound came suddenly, brutally, the low growl of a heavy-duty truck engine, much louder than Cole's sedan cutting through the night. The truck rolled to a stop right outside the main service door, its headlights cutting sharp, white rectangles through the grimy windows before being abruptly shut off. Doors slammed, 2 of them, muffled voices, rough and low. One of them laughed, a short, ugly bark of a sound. Leo's blood ran cold. They were here. He flattened himself against the floor behind a pile of debris, his heart threatening to hammer its way out of his chest. He heard the screech of a crowbar against the metal of the service door, followed by a loud bang as it was forced open. 2 large, hulking silhouettes appeared in the doorway, their forms black against the faint moonlight. They carried heavy flashlights, their powerful beams cutting through the darkness, and something else, large, red canisters. "Gasoline. You check the back. I'll start splashing this stuff around up front," one of the men grunted, his voice a low rumble. "Cole wants this whole place to be a crater by morning. He said there's a box, a metal footlocker. Find it. If the squatter and his kid are in here, too bad." He said no witnesses. The words, casual and brutal, confirmed Leo's worst fears. This wasn't just a threat. It was an execution order. The casual disregard for his and Mia's lives was the most chilling thing he had ever heard. These weren't men. They were tools, blunt instruments of Cole's will. One of them began to move deeper into the warehouse, his flashlight beams sweeping across the debris, getting closer and closer to Mia's hiding spot. The other man unscrewed the cap of a gasoline can, and the sharp, acrid smell of fuel instantly filled the air, a promise of the inferno to come. It was now or never. The beam of the flashlight swept past Leo's hiding place, then swung back, hovering dangerously close to the pile of pallets where Mia was hidden. He could hear her let out a tiny, terrified whimper. The man stopped, his head tilting. "Hear that?" he called out to his partner. Leo knew he had run out of time. He rose from his crouch, his entire body a single, focused instrument of action. He launched himself at the towering, unstable stack of steel shelves. Putting his shoulder and all of his weight into the rusted metal support, he pushed with a guttural roar, a sound of pure, primal fury that ripped from his throat. For a heart-stopping second, the massive structure resisted, groaning in protest. He gave it one last desperate shove, pouring every ounce of his adrenaline, his rage, and his terror for his daughter into the effort. The rusted bolts holding the unit together finally sheared off with a series of sharp, metallic cracks. The result was catastrophic. The entire shelving unit, weighing several tons, began to tilt. It teetered for a slow-motion eternity, a metal giant losing its balance, and then it came down. It fell with a deafening, apocalyptic roar of screaming, twisting metal and shattering concrete. The hardened bags of cement exploded on impact, sending up a massive, choking cloud of grey dust that instantly filled the entire front section of the warehouse. The crash was so violent that the concrete floor shuddered, and dust and debris rained down from the high ceiling. It was a sound loud enough to wake the dead. The man who had been approaching Mia's hiding spot screamed, a high-pitched cry of shock and pain, as the edge of the collapsing unit caught him, pinning his leg to the floor. The other man, near the door, was thrown backward by the shockwave, dropping his flashlight and the open gasoline can, which clattered across the floor, spewing its flammable contents. The chaos was his shield. The warehouse was plunged into near-total darkness, filled with a blinding, choking cloud of dust and the agonized screams of the injured man. "What the hell was that?" the other thug yelled, his voice laced with panic. "Mike, are you okay?" This was Leo's chance. He didn't hesitate. He scrambled through the dust cloud, his eyes burning, his lungs seizing. He scooped up a terrified, sobbing Mia from her hiding spot, holding her head against his chest to shield her from the dust. "It's okay, baby. I've got you," he gasped, his voice raw. He ran, half blind, towards the back of the warehouse, his bad leg screaming in protest, but he ignored it. The footlocker was where he had left it, a dark, solid shape in the gloom. He grabbed its heavy leather handle with his free hand, the weight a familiar, reassuring burden. Adrenaline surged through him, a white-hot current that banished all pain, all exhaustion. He reached the jagged opening he had made in the back wall. Outside, the night air was cold and clean, a stark contrast to the choking hell he was leaving behind. He could hear the uninjured thug shouting, disoriented in the dust cloud, trying to find his partner. "We gotta go. The whole place is coming down." They had seconds. Leo pushed Mia gently through the opening first, then followed, dragging the heavy footlocker after him. The sharp edge of the torn metal ripped a long gash in his arm, but he barely felt it. He was outside. They were free. He stood for a second in the moonlight, his chest heaving, his body trembling, listening to the shouts and chaos inside the warehouse. The smell of gasoline was thick in the air. He knew they couldn't just run. He saw the spilled gas canister lying near a pile of oil-soaked rags. He still had the disposable lighter in his pocket. A terrible, fiery idea bloomed in his mind. It was what Cole wanted, a fire. He would give him one, but he stopped himself. That was Cole's way. Destruction. Violence. He was not his enemy. His grandfather's journal wasn't just a record of a crime. It was a testament to a man trying to find redemption. Burning the warehouse, even with those men inside, would make him no better than them. Justice, not vengeance. He looked at Mia, her face pale with terror, and knew what he had to do. He picked her up, grabbed the handle of the footlocker, and ran. He fled into the labyrinth of the industrial night, leaving the two thugs to their fate in the darkness. He ran with the strength of a man who had stared into the abyss and climbed back out. Behind him, the warehouse stood as a dark, silent silhouette against the moonlit sky, a tomb that had failed to claim him. Ahead of him, in the distance, was a ventilation shaft, a light in the darkness, and a frightened old clockmaker who represented his only hope for a future. The race was far from over, but for the first time, he felt like he might actually win. The third ventilation shaft was a black, gaping mouth breathing a foul air of damp earth and rust. Leo collapsed beside it, his body finally surrendering to the crushing exhaustion. He lowered the footlocker to the ground with a heavy thud, the sound echoing in the industrial silence. He cradled Mia, who was shivering with fever, her shallow breaths fogging in the cold night air. Just as despair began to creep back in, a hunched figure emerged from the shadows of the tunnel. It was Silas, his face pale and drawn in the moonlight. He clutched an old brick-like cell phone in his trembling hand. Without a word, he took the crude map from Leo, then dialed a number from memory. His voice, when he spoke, was a reedy, terrified whisper, but it did not waver. "My name is Silas Croft. I have information regarding the 40-year-old criminal conspiracy orchestrated by Judge Arthur Cole, and I am with the witness." The silence that followed was filled only by the sound of Mia's coughing and the distant, lonely wail of a train. An hour later, two dark sedans pulled up, their movements silent and professional. These were not the flashy, predatory vehicles of Cole's world. They were government cars, anonymous and serious, Men in dark practical suits emerged, their faces grim and focused. One of them, a woman with sharp, intelligent eyes, introduced herself as an investigator from the State Attorney General's office. Another, a younger man with an intense, hungry look, was the journalist Silas had contacted. They moved with a quiet efficiency that was profoundly reassuring. The investigator knelt by Mia, ignoring Leo's filthy clothes and gaunt appearance, and wrapped her in a thick, clean wool blanket she produced from her car. The warmth and softness of the fabric felt like an impossible luxury. For the first time in what felt like a lifetime, Leo felt the crushing weight on his chest lighten. He wasn't a rat in a trap anymore. He was under protection. The hunt was over, and the reckoning was about to begin, in a sterile, brightly lit conference room miles away from the city's Rotti. The footlocker sat on a long, polished table. It looked ancient and out of place, a relic from a forgotten war. An investigator wearing blue latex gloves snapped them on and lifted the heavy lid. He carefully removed the leather-bound journal, the bundles of deeds tied with faded string, and the brittle, yellowed letters. Each item was handled with the reverence of a museum piece, photographed, and placed in a clear evidence bag. Leo sat watching, a cup of hot, sweet coffee warming his numb hands. Silas sat beside him, looking smaller than ever under the fluorescent lights, but his eyes were clear. The air hummed with the quiet, focused energy of professionals uncovering a long-buried truth. The secrets that had festered in the dark, dusty office for 40 years were finally seeing the light, and their power to cause fear was being replaced by their power to bring justice. The weight of the metal box was finally being lifted from Leo's soul. Silas, with a glass of water before him and a digital recorder capturing his every word, began to speak. The old clockmaker, who had hidden from the world for 4 decades, found his voice. He recounted the story with a painful, precise clarity, his memory a perfect, horrifying mechanism. He described the process of falsifying the deeds, the fear on the faces of the families, the escalating arguments between the two Arthurs. His voice broke only once, when he described the final, violent confrontation in the office, the shouting, the sickening crash, and the terrifying, dead-eyed calm of Judge Cole emerging alone. He confessed his own cowardice, his 40 years of silent guilt. It was a torrent of truth, a dam of fear finally breaking. The investigators listened in rapt silence, their pens scratching furiously across notepads. Leo watched the old man, not with pity, but with a profound sense of awe. In that sterile room, the frail clockmaker was the bravest man he had ever known, his confession the final, vital gear in the machine of justice. Leo didn't see the arrest himself. He saw it the way the rest of the world did, on a flat-screen television in the clean, anonymous safety of a state-provided hotel room. The news footage was dramatic. A fleet of unmarked state police cars descended upon Judge Cole's sprawling estate in the wealthiest part of the city, their flashing lights painting the manicured lawns in strobing reds and blues. The reporter's voice was breathless with disbelief. The camera zoomed in on the massive oak doors being opened not by a butler, but by stern-faced agents, and then Judge Cole emerged, flanked by 2 investigators. The mask of benevolent power he had worn for a lifetime was gone, replaced by a rictus of pure, unrestrained fury. His eyes, which had been so cold and calculating in the warehouse, were now wild with impotent rage. The final damning shot was a close-up of his frail, liver-spotted hands being snapped into a pair of gleaming steel handcuffs. The sound of the click was the most satisfying thing Leo had ever heard. The story detonated like a bomb in the state capitol. The name Arthur Cole, once a synonym for justice and philanthropy, was now shorthand for corruption and murder. The journalist's front-page story, citing the irrefutable evidence from Vance's journal, triggered a political earthquake. Headlines screamed from every newspaper and cable news channel. Judge Cole accused of decades-long criminal conspiracy. The Vance-Cole land grab, a secret history of theft. State Attorney General vows to uproot entire network. The investigation spiraled outwards, implicating other powerful figures, politicians, police officials, businessmen, all caught in the web of favors and blackmail that Cole had woven over half a century. From his safe house, Leo watched the empire of dirt and tears his grandfather had helped build crumble to dust on live television. He held a sleeping Mia in his arms, her breathing deep and even for the first time in weeks, and felt the first, fragile shoots of peace begin to grow in the barren soil of his heart. The legal fallout was swift and decisive. In a series of court rulings that captivated the state, the entire Vance Cole land-grabbing scheme was declared fraudulent from its inception. Every deed, every contract, every foreclosure was invalidated. The descendants of some families were found and compensated, but the vast majority of the land, now worth a staggering sum as the city had grown around it, had no clear claimant other than the original fraudulent partnership. In a landmark decision, the court ruled that since Arthur Vance had intended to expose the crime and return the properties, his share of the assets would not be seized. As his sole living heir, the man who had risked everything to bring the truth to light, Leo was declared the legal owner of half of the stolen empire. He sat in a lawyer's plush office and signed the final document, the pen feeling alien in his calloused hand. He stared at the number on the paper, a figure with so many zeros it seemed impossible. He thought of the 4745. The first thing he bought was not a car or a house, but the best pediatric pulmonologist in the state. He sat in a warm, quiet examination room, the air smelling of antiseptic and calm, and listened as a doctor with kind eyes explained that Mia's cough was a treatable case of bronchitis, aggravated by cold and damp. She would be fine, completely fine. That night, in a furnished apartment that felt like a palace, he cooked a real meal. The scent of roasting chicken and vegetables filled the air, a smell he thought he had forgotten. Mia, wrapped in a fluffy bathrobe after a long, warm bath, sat at the table drawing with a new set of crayons. She wasn't drawing a dark, scary warehouse. She was drawing a bright yellow sun over a green hill. Later, he tucked her into a soft, clean bed. He watched her chest rise and fall in the gentle rhythm of healthy sleep, the rattling cough replaced by a profound, beautiful silence. He touched the warm radiator by her bed, the simple heat a miracle, and wept with a relief so total it felt like a rebirth. 6 months later, Leo stood on a windswept hill, the spring sun warm on his face. The air was clean, carrying the scent of pine and fresh-cut grass, a world away from the stench of rust and decay. His new cane, made of polished cherry wood, felt solid and comfortable, his limp almost gone thanks to proper surgery. Below him, in a green valley, the frame of a new house was rising, its skeleton of fresh lumber a testament to a future being built. A healthy, vibrant Mia ran laughing through a field of wildflowers, her hair flying in the wind. This was their land now, his land. But he knew it wasn't just his. He had spent weeks with his lawyers establishing the Vance Family Restitution Trust, a fund that would use the vast majority of the land's profits to find and compensate the descendants of every family his grandfather and Cole had wronged. It wasn't about the money. It was about cleaning the slate, redeeming a name and turning a legacy of theft into a legacy of healing. He felt a small hand slip into his. Mia was beside him, pointing down at the rising house. "Is that our forever home, Daddy?" she asked, her voice clear and strong. He knelt down, his strong leg taking the weight easily, and pulled her into a hug, breathing in the scent of her clean hair and the sunshine on her skin. He looked out at the horizon, at the endless green and the bright blue sky. The weight of his love for her, once a crushing burden of failure, was now the lightest, most wonderful thing in the world. He had not just found a roof, he had built a foundation for justice. He had not just survived the darkness, he had brought the truth into the light. Their story of despair had been rewritten into one of redemption, proving that even in the deepest, coldest ruins, a single spark of hope can be enough to start a fire that burns away the shadows. If stories like Leo's inspire you to believe that justice can prevail, then subscribe to our channel for more tales of overcoming the impossible.